Now you can't see anybody. They're all good.
Thanks, everyone. I'm David Walmsley. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail in Canada. And it's a pleasure to be here, running through walls. And as you see from that medley of challenges, those walls come in many shapes and sizes. Harry was maybe a diminutive fellow physically, but the walls that he ran through, I think, inspire so many of us in the room today, and that's certainly why I'm here, because of the belief that investigative journalism makes a difference, and it matters. And I'm joined on the stage by three excellent practitioners of that work who are committed to telling the stories that they themselves didn't realize they would end up telling. Selam Gebrekidan, beside me, is an award-winning investigative journalist for the New York Times, whose reporting has covered everything from human trafficking in Libya to the British criminal justice system. Bradley Hope, the far end, a best-selling author and the co-founder of Project Brazen, a company that fearlessly takes on the big stories, turns them into books, podcasts, documentaries, and profit. And Maurice Tamman, Mo, a reporter and editor at Reuters, who uses data, which is now, I think, table stakes, to tell the important stories of our time. I'm going to start with Bradley. Your stunning report on the misuse of Malaysia's government fund, which was 1MBD, exposed one of the biggest money laundering frauds in history, and ultimately led to the downfall of Malaysia's Prime Minister in 2018. Tell us about the biggest walls that you've come up against in that story, which, of course, became bigger than you could possibly have realized when you began it.
I think from the very beginning, we kept running into the threat of legal action from Malaysia, from being out on your own, writing these stories suggesting that there was massive fraud, and the people of Malaysia weren't quite sure who to believe. And then over time, we faced all kinds of different threats. There was things like Tom, when he was in Malaysia, we had to kind of evacuate him because there was an attempt to arrest him. We had cybersecurity threats. And then we also had just the immense challenge of moving beyond the first leak that we had. And so we were constantly trying to think about how could we push this story further. And we kind of invented a lot of techniques along the way. And we kind of, I guess in a way, learned under fire how to practice what I think of as the dark arts of journalism, which is the unteachable part, where you learn how to apply pressure and stay within the lines, but get pretty close to it with the kinds of people you interact with, And I think to this day, I know a lot of great criminals now that are on my Rolodex that guide me on all the kind of questions I have about how the world really works.
You were a young reporter at the Journal when you came across the story. Your colleague was the original reporter on the story, but you discovered very early on that you had connections into Abu Dhabi, which were the starting point for so many investigations, in that you pulled the string and other parts unraveled. Can you tell us a little bit about how you began? Because there are many in the room who are starting their careers and will take inspiration, I think, from that.
Yeah, luckily the Wall Street Journal is a very collegial place, and they allowed me to join the story, even though it had been started by other people. A lot of what we did started with very old-fashioned, simple things like reviewing documents, financial statements. And one of the big early discoveries was there's some money that had gone missing between Malaysia and Abu Dhabi. And there was this person on the Malaysian side who was trying to persuade us that there was nothing to see here, obviously one of those criminals on my Rolodex now, who said to us, "It's not true." And I said to him, I made this up on the spot, I said, "I believe you, but my editor doesn't. So can you give me a document?" And so he gave me a wire transfer document, which we brought to the other side, and we were able to confirm that there was a fictitious entity that had been created that looked like the other entity. And that to me is just a good example of how to kind of even use an oppositional force in your favor, and that helped us have a big exclusive about $1.4 billion of the fraud. It went missing. We found out where it was. And just throughout, we had so many people who were, in some way, they benefited from the fraud, and persuading them to speak to us was one of the biggest challenges we had. And we had to just be persistent and find them wherever they are in the world.
And how long did it take you from soup to nuts for the story to come to its conclusion?
It was one of those stories where we were publishing things all the time over years. But I think until the US government brought their asset forfeiture case, which filled in all the gaps. We were kind of like out on our own with our fully exposed. So it took about 2 years probably before we felt comfortable.
And never sued.
Never sued, lots of threats.
That's interesting. The chill versus the reality. Selam, you did a lot of work in South Africa looking at corruption, but you've said that for you, some of the biggest challenges, some of the biggest walls are actually here trying to report on Britain. Can you explain a little bit about that sense, which on the surface seems striking?
Last year, my colleague Jane Bradley and I were taking a closer look at the British criminal justice system. And all along the way, and I'd started on that project a few years earlier, and all along the way from the courts to police departments to basic data that should have been available from the ONS here, the Office of National Statistics, there were so many impediments along the way. But part of it is, court documents that we just take for granted would be accessible to the public and in the public's interest were not necessarily so. We had to fight judges in order to allow us to get documents that by law we should have been able to get pretty straightforwardly. We had a lot of fights on freedom of information requests and so on and so forth. The biggest one for me, though, is the last story in that series was about a man who spent much of his life in prison, and he was a drug dealer, but the last charge was under new legislation, the modern slavery legislation. And I had finally managed to convince him to speak to me while he was serving time in prison. And I was very excited when he tried to add me to one of his visitors so that I could actually speak to him. But I got a call from the prison ward. And when they asked me what my relationship was with him, I said, I'm a reporter. They immediately hung up, and that was it. I had absolutely no access to him after that. Not even through letters, which struck me as even more draconian and more restrictive than, people in federal prisons in the U.S. So I had to essentially wait until he was released from prison in order to complete that story. And eventually as well, we had to, much as what happened in previous projects, we had to really build our own databases, collecting piecemeal information from the Ministry of Justice, from the CPS here, the prosecution services, because the government, in a lot of ways, and the judicial system had not really kept to its promise to track a lot of data, and so whenever we encountered these problems, we had to find creative ways of getting around them, especially with the database.
Yeah, it seems striking that you worked previously in New York, coming then to the UK and finding that the British system is a lot harder to navigate. There is less natural transparency, and yet there is tremendous libel tourism in England. So there seems to be a problem in the country with respect to how you can prosecute the journalism as effectively as possible. So how do you get around that stonewalling? I mean, what techniques do you use to try and not only figure out what you should be investigating, but keeping the investigation going?
Right. So I'll give you another example. We had a project taking a look at the European farm subsidies a few years ago. And it is the biggest ticket item on the budget. So it's about 65 billion at that point. And we thought, well, there has to be some internal scrutiny. All these, at that point, 28 states must be keeping that data. And other journalists in Europe had done some work on that, in about a decade earlier than us. And we also knew that there were auditing databases where they collected all information about where the money was going, who was getting paid, and how much every year. And so we thought, well, we should be able to access that. This is Europe, after all. And we expected a lot of transparency. What we found, with me and my colleagues, was quite the opposite. And not only were we not allowed to access any aspect of the data, when we went to Ispra, just outside of Milan, a beautiful place, where there's a big scientific community doing research on the effects of the farm subsidies on climate change, we had minders following us around the entire time, basically keeping the scientists who should be objective from talking to us, chilling that any sort of communication. So all along the way, we just encountered, again, as a journalist, for me, when I see a wall like this, especially if I don't expect it to be there, it makes me even more determined to get behind it, to get around it. What are you trying to hide? So in that case, we essentially had to go country by country and build databases on our own. So I used to work for Mo at Reuters. He taught me much of everything I know about data journalism. So I put together the database, and when I came across, when I hit the limits of my own technical skills, I fortunately work for an organization where there are a lot of people who are smarter than me, and I reached out to one of my colleagues, and we did. He helped me out with figuring out exactly where to go, and eventually, we had a map of specific farms in central Hungary. So we went there. We spoke to these farmers, wonderful people. We broke bread with them. We ate their sausages. They welcomed us into their homes, and we eventually got the story. So that's it. I guess perseverance and determination.
So that's the second wall, the wall of getting the data and then knowing what to use with it in creating pattern. Mo, you spent over a year shifting through data to produce a word we're very hesitant to use in investigative journalism, but the definitive report on how fish and other marine species are migrating because of rising ocean temperatures. You were able to show that, you were able to prove it. What was the biggest wall that you came up to when reporting not only on that, but more broadly on the greater challenge, which is that of climate change?
Well, let me suggest that there's an entirely different kind of wall when you're reporting on climate change and perhaps other subjects too, and that is the skepticism that readers bring with them when they read the stories, right? And that's a curious battle that you have to face, but I think it's an issue that we have to face collectively now, that people bring skepticism that perhaps didn't exist 20 years ago to every story you write. And I think we made
Is that a skepticism based on polarized thinking, or is that a skepticism because of improved media literacy?
I think that that's a polarization issue in large part. I mean, sure, I think there's a sophistication for some people that allows them to be skeptical, and I'm fine with that. The other one I'm less fine with. I think data journalism is important in part because you tell stories that are much harder to dismiss. If you're writing a story that is built on a series of anecdotes, it's easy to dismiss that as a story that has been, where the facts have been cherry-picked. If I've produced an analysis, in this case, of how the center of a particular species of fish is now off the coast of Long Island, for example, and it used to be off the coast of South Carolina. And I can show you that, in fact, it's not just one species, but scores of species that are being tracked. And you can show how temperatures have risen in concert with that. It's really difficult to dismiss that. It's a fact, right? And as long as you aren't playing silly games with the numbers, you can't just look at this and say, well, it's the media bias. It is there. And I think that we collectively have to understand that if our readers are bringing skepticism to our stories, we have to be able to give them some reason to want to believe us. And I think more than ever, having an empirical spine of the story is essential for especially investigative journalism. I try to do that in all my work now,
One of the principles of Harry's investigative journalism was to remember that the newsroom loses interest at precisely the time the audience begins to pay attention. So when you offer data, and indeed with climate change, a sense of hopelessness, I think, exists for many in the audience who are not necessarily skeptical, but they feel hopeless and helpless. So you tell me that the fish are on the move. What can I do about that? What do you do to keep the audience engaged and to ensure that there is a longer shelf life to the story rather than simply providing the data and leaving it at that?
Well, and climate change has a particularly unique problem in that regard, right? Because there's lots of ifs and ands and pots and pans when it comes to climate change. If we don't cut emissions by this amount, by that date, then by this date, that's going to happen. It's all outside the window of a person's lifespan. So you're asking me to make huge sacrifices politically, economically, socially, culturally, for what? So that 3 generations from now can have a planet that's livable? Yeah, well, if I'm sitting here and I'm analyzing it from an intellectual point of view, absolutely I agree with you, right? But if I'm sitting at the dinner table and I'm trying to pay my bills and you're asking me to somehow subsidize 4 generations in the future to make a choice, it becomes much harder. And I think that's why, we've had congressional hearings in the States since 1988 where they have routinely said, we are on the road to hell if we don't stop. No one has paid any attention to that. Only now, when the reality of climate change is upon us, are we actually starting to do something about it. But it's not very much, and it's certainly not enough to really fundamentally affect how our planet is going to deal with the fact that we have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and as a result of that, too much heat.
And it speaks to another Harry's principles, which was this issue: when you undertake an investigation, you must be relentless and resource it appropriately. The idea of the pressure points the three of you have faced in your investigations differ. Sometimes it's lack of access, and sometimes it's threats or perceived threats or chill. Bradley, you have been secretly recorded, physically surveilled, and warned by Google that a foreign government was trying to hack into your personal Gmail account. So you decided to hire a surveillance expert to train you in evading surveillance. Let's take a look at a video clip.
I'm just one person targeted by an industry fueled by oligarchs, foreign intelligence services, and the ultra-rich who deploy this kind of physical surveillance every day all over the world. Within the space of 200 meters, I've been tracked by car, by foot, and by cameras. I don't realize it, but the operative behind me stays quite close in this crowded station. I've hired this team, but I don't even notice the operative filming me. I get off the tube at Green Park and a new team takes over. This normal-looking couple are actually operatives. And this former paparazzi is hiding inside his tinted car taking photos with a long lens. Another looks like he could be anybody. They call this going gray.
Which just terrifies me. I mean, I'm paranoid at the best of times. So what did you learn, and what tips have you got for those in the room?
Well, I like to live by this principle from this New York editor, Peter Kaplan: never hold your best stuff. And it's something that I kind of always have to remind myself. So it's a way of not being afraid to chase stories that are going to have ramifications or that are embarrassing for other people. And in my experience, where the inspiration for this was someone showed me a picture of me meeting someone else, and instead of being kind of letting myself be dissuaded, I was kind of inspired. Like that someone would go to such lengths to follow me around, and so I try to use that as fuel in a sense, and to learn the practices of it. And I try to do that all the time. So that's what this experience was I wanted to share that knowledge with other people, that every day across London, there's teams of 12, 15 people following someone around. And it could be a journalist, it could be a human rights activist, it could be a dissident, it could be somebody's husband. So yeah, that's just how I try to look at things, so I don't get scared, that I'm actually kind of inspired by it instead.
Amazing. Selam, you talked about data and getting into the Hungarian story a little bit. You had to find a creative workaround because you were denied access by the EU when it came to Viktor Orban and exposing corruption. Can you explain a little bit about the challenges that you faced there and what you created to get around the obstacles?
Right. That was the same story that I mentioned earlier on the farm subsidies. I mean, I actually want to talk about the brave journalists who are locally based, who face greater danger than us parachuting in and getting the story and moving out. And we're essentially beyond the reach of the Hungarian government, but we met many journalists, and especially one source, a man called Angyan, who was a close confidant of Orban, and really a principled man who fell out eventually. And everything was taken away from him, including an organic farm that he'd started, which was just razed to the ground. It was a very spiteful act that really broke the man's heart. In Czechia, there were reporters who helped us out, who continue to report on corruption and wrongdoing in their own countries, again, at greater risk to themselves than to us. I've worked in places where I'll give you an example. I was in Ethiopia reporting on the Boeing crash in 2019, and that's when I felt that danger a lot more than anywhere else. I'm originally from Ethiopia, and eventually when the government did not really like the story that I was reporting, I was chased out of the country, and I haven't been able to return since then. That's 4 years that I've had to stay away. And I always try to be mindful. Yes, there are obstacles to the work that we do as investigative reporters, but most of us are lucky enough to work for international institutions that will back us, that have the First Amendment lawyers, that have the resources to evacuate you out of, war zones when things get hairy. But there are multiple journalists who actually stick to it and do it day to day, facing this kind of surveillance as they're taking their kids to school. And it's a very good perspective to have about, what you're facing.
So that's another wall, isn't it? It's the wall of exile in a certain sense. But on the other side of that wall sit what I believe, and I think, Bradley, you're making this point about the inspiration against the challenges you face, an absolute army of people who want to help. One of the questions I'm asked most often is, why do people help journalists? Why do they put themselves at risk? Why would a local who isn't able to leave say, I'm prepared to commit to this work, even though they know they're going to work with you, working for a bigger organization, but you're going to leave, or you have the chance to leave? Why do they do that? I want to ask each of you a little bit about your experiences of that. Selam, why do they speak to you?
It's a question I often ask myself. Why are people talking to you? Especially with investigative projects, they're giving you so much of their time. They're really allowing you into their lives, into their homes. And I think part of it is moral clarity. Some people do have that, and they have a very strong sense of right and wrong, and when they see wrong, they want to correct it. Some of it is, you're also offering a listening ear. You're there, you're asking perhaps questions that they hoped other people would ask them, but have never done so. And in some ways, they lean on you as well, even though it's a reporter-source relationship, especially with women who've gone through traumatic events. For example, I've had the experience of, they talked to me because I just asked, and that was it. But it's a very good question, and I don't know if I have the right answer.
Mo, you've a long experience in this world. What is your sense?
Well, when I was a young reporter, I had an editor. I used to have to write obits. And sometimes I was a little lazy on writing my obits. And I had an editor once pull me over and say, everyone's entitled to one good story in their life, even if they're dead. If I can adapt that slightly and say that everyone is entitled to one good story in their life. And I think that's part of the human experience. If you're going through some form of hell, there's something about being human that wants that story to be told. And you will go to great lengths to communicate that story to a broader audience so that the world can understand the hell that you are going through, or the hell that your community is experiencing, whatever it is. And suffer through great danger as a result of that. And I think we see it every day in news stories all over the world. And I think that's the fundamental cause of it.
Bradley?
I think everybody knows about whistleblowers and people trying to do the right thing. In investigative journalism, you have to also be aware of the other side of the spectrum, the people that want to mislead you, that want to tell you that somebody else did something bad, who want to even absolve themselves of something bad they did. And I find those people are often the most valuable sources you can have, because they're the ones that are most reckless with sharing documents, with telling you the truth that you shouldn't know. In some ways, the do-gooder is actually a hard source to deal with, because they're always operating within the lines and they're not willing to cross those lines in ways that benefit the overall telling of the truth of the story.
Ladies and gentlemen, 3 of the truth tellers.